Hello, welcome to a particularly chaotic instructional patching video. This one's perhaps a little bit more of an intense patch. I'll do a dedicated patch performance video, which I will link below, which will be a bit more of a rehearsed performance take. There's going to be a lot of sounds throughout this video, of course, but it might be a bit less polished in terms of compositional timing. I'll be following the same format as usual, so I'll break down and talk through the signal flow. I'll take out all these cable ties and try and trace things through. I'll then go off screen and transcribe the full patch, and then pull everything out, then rebuild the entire patch from scratch. Try and get as close as possible to what we're experiencing here. You might have guessed the CSL is the primary sound source in this patch. A very busy sound coming from it. That's then going into the arbhar for some granular processing, as well as using it for its reverb controls. There's also a harmonic element, which is coming from the harmony into Saïch. And then, for a bit of a wild card, we've got this guy here, which is the first production release from Manifold Research Centre. This module is called the Tetragrid, and it's from the same designer who brought us the Leon, Imo Scampa, who has been part of Team Instro for a good few years now. And this thing is very cool. It kind of inspired this whole patch, so definitely check that out. I'll put all the links below. Yeah, there's a lot to do, so let's dive right in. Okay, here we go. This could go long because there's a lot of elements to this patch to try and trace back through. What I've done, I've set up the scope so that I've got channel 4 visible, not in XY mode, and I'll probably patch certain things direct, just so we can audition certain aspects of the voices as we go, but I'll try and be fairly minimal on depatching at this stage, because I've still got to do a full transcription of this thing so that I've got something to refer to when rebuilding it. Anything that I do miss at this stage will be caught for the rebuild stage of this video. Yeah, the cable ties, I just had to clear up some space visibly for getting access to the Tetragrid and for accessing the harmony. Okay, so our output that we're hearing is effectively just the signal, the stereo signal coming from the arbhar. I'm using the Leon here as a mixer for a couple of things. I'm able to combine a few different voices together that are being mixed to the output, as well as mixing going into the arbhar. I think we'll come to that in a bit. Let's start with the raw sound source. So what we're hearing are these two outputs from the final outputs, the wavefolder outputs from the CSL. And this is effectively just a complex algorithm, FM algorithm of a circular FM. So you can see there's FM attenuation level up on both voices. But hold down the center button, we can see the index routing has this LED, so that indicates that the FM ratio is being controlled from the index pot. So that's the sine waves from each oscillator through a pair of VCAs internally going to the opposite oscillator's FM input jack normal, and then that's got a certain amount of level. These two being lit here indicate that the opposite oscillator sine wave is also normaling through the VCAs to the opposite oscillator's symmetry input. So we're actually getting a mix of both voices through both wavefolders, creating what's fundamentally a stereo voice of some common signals at each one, but they're being processed via the two wavefolders independently. So it gets quite complex quite quickly. What I'll do is patch from here. I'm just going to disconnect my outputs. Let me just hook them up there, and I'll patch from channel 4, and this way I can monitor certain signals as I go. So let's listen to this top voice. So there's a bit of an ostinato and a repeating pattern going on, so that's actually coming from the Tetragrid. Let's check out the lower voice. So again, there's a rhythmic element, but it's essentially just a combination of these two sine waves through the wavefolder, and there's two flavors of that sound together. So the actual changes in the pattern, they're coming from the volt per octave control. I'll listen to this top voice again, and I'll unpatch these two. So there's still some rhythmic patterns coming in. So that's because I've got CV going into the wavefold depth controls. So anything at these two inputs is effectively automating the position of the fader. So if I pull these out, this is the static raw voice from the CSL. So if we bring the index all the way down, we're hearing just the straight oscillator through the wavefolder. If I bring up the index, then we're getting cross FM or circular FM between the two voices, as well as the lower voice coming into the symmetry input. So if I reduce this fader, then that's me controlling the amplitude of the lower sine wave through this wavefolder, in addition to this top one. So let me put these back in. I'll put these full per octave signals back in as well. So because it's a complex relationship between the two voices, the smallest change in fundamental of either oscillator is going to change the whole pattern together. So they're intrinsically linked, as well as having this additional modulation coming in. Yeah, okay, so that's enough of that. Let me find the right patch cable to put back in. This one here. And I'll go back to our main patch left and right, which is going through the arbhar. Okay, so through the arbhar at the moment, I've got the blend control fully dry. So we've just got our input signal, which is going through a few different other stages, but we can consider that as being these two signals mixed together to mono, to simplify at this stage. I'll reduce this down. So this is CV that's going to the mod input of the CV expander, which is hidden behind these cables here. So that's adding the reverb throws, but this is kind of just the raw sound coming from the CSL. So what's adding these rhythmic elements? That's the next question. This is all actually coming from the Tetragrid. So you can see there are 6 outputs on the top here. pull down a bit. So there's 6 outputs on the top here. So these are all output jacks. So they're all CV sources. Fundamentally, the Tetragrid is 6 analog oscillators that are cross-modulating each other. And they're cross-modulating via these triangles, the contacts on the grid, which can be interacted with by skin contact, much like you would interact with the Psions biosensor input. But these are actually connecting outputs to FM inputs, essentially. I don't know the exact mapping. I'm not sure anyone knows apart from IMO. And there's a steel plate on the back which makes the whole thing magnetic. So these magnets can be placed and moved around to make contacts, essentially patch points. The 2 outer, I believe it's the 2 outer pots, or output CVs, have got direct control over their rate via these 2 pots. So you can kind of set 2 fundamental rates, and then how they interact with the others will determine what the outputs are. For the most part, they're gate outputs, but I believe the raw cores are sorted, so you'll get some ramps, or if it jumps up to audio rate, you might get really fast oscillation patterns that will be ramp-like. But I'm basically reading them and treating them as gates. So I've just got like hard signals that are either used for clocking or switching. So the 2 outputs that are going to the CSL are these 2 here, so the 2 center ones, and I've got them coming out and going through 2 channels of a tan H. So because they're gate signals, the tan H isn't actually applying any real wave shaping, but I've got a degree of amplitude control. So if I bring these down, then I'm reducing the amplitude of these gate signals, which are in turn increasing or decreasing the fundamental pitch intervals for each oscillator, which changes the ratio, etc., etc. So yeah, that's just a very crude use case of the tan H. I had the 2 channels spare and didn't have any other attenuator methods, so it gave me a bit more control than I would otherwise have had. Cool. Okay, so that's gate sources coming from this chaotic, game board magnet FM routing madness. So that's controlling the behavior of the CSL's FM algorithm. On the outputs, I've got further processing to give me more of a rhythmic element. You can see these outputs are coming out and they're going into the 2 channels of this time switch, and each one is set to latching. So you can see as the LED buttons are toggling on and off, these are being controlled from this cease, which is buried here. So this was a bit of a quirk that I landed on afterwards. Originally, I think I had just 2 of the channels from the Tetragrid used for controlling the switching, but to get it more rhythmically consistent, I think it was the aim, I went with a cease, which is not actually used for its envelope output at all, but I'm using the gate outputs, which correlate to the segment LEDs here. So the LEDs being driven are actually driven from the gate sources that come from the output. So every time this guy gets triggered from this leftmost output, it triggers the envelope. The output stage from the attack, that's used to clock this tie, the sample and hold, which is actually going on to control the buffer layer on the arbhar. The reason I did that is the tie wasn't actually being triggered directly from the output from the Tetragrid, or not all of them. It depended on the context, because if there was a bit of a ramp on the start, it wasn't a hard enough sharp edge for the wasn't a sharp enough edge for the sample and hold clock to register. So this way I'm using a dedicated trigger gate signal from the attack phase to clock the sample and hold. I'm then using the decay time and release time gate outputs, and they are going into the two switch controls of the time. So this way, every time the cease is triggered, there's a fixed decay time, so that gate will last a certain duration. If it gets to sustain, it will then flip to the release. So it adds a degree of consistency to the timing of the clock. Although if it's clocked at a lower rate than the decay, then it'll preempt it. So there can be times where one of the switches might not toggle every cycle of the pattern. It's very much dependent upon what's going on here in the Tetragrid. So the output being the leftmost one, I've got that pot turned all the way down. And even with the magnet pieces consistently on the surface, even if I bridge contacts with fingers, that will be enough contact for it to interact with the FM internal to the Tetragrid. So the rates will all cycle, and you'll get different patterns. Yeah, it's good fun. So so switch cases there, coming out of there. And the outputs are going to, I believe they're going to the Leon for mixing. Yes, here we are. So the top two input channels of the Leon are the CSL raw sources. Okay, so the next stage from that, take this guy out. Okay, so I think there's a few variants going on here. That's right. Okay, so just to add a bit more confusion, there's a parallel send of the source. I'll come back to that. Okay, so this is my main output, which is going to the arbhar, and it's actually going via tan-H just to give me an extra bit of compression or limiting before hitting the input analog channel, which again is tan-H based, but this just gave me a little bit extra control, especially when I was introducing additional feedback. So this output here from the Leon, I'm pulling from these two top sources, and this is using two purple pins. So these are attenuation pins, and these actually attenuate by to a quarter of the amplitude. I played about with different ones between that or unity gain or the blue pins, which are half amplitude. So these are summing to the alpha output, but as nothing's patched, these cascade, and I believe between these two outputs there is a further attenuation stage, so it should be a different mix ratio compared to if I pin it direct here. There we are. So the CSL is just that bit louder going direct, so there's an extra degree of attenuation when I'm patching to the first column nodes. There we go. And now let's look at this output. So I believe this jack is, yeah. So the furthest output is a combination of the two raw CSL voices. That's using another two purple pins at the last column's nodes. So that's giving me a combined mix of the CSL, and that's going into the FM input of this Nyoni, which is set to through 0 FM mode with only half amplitude going through. So this is performing through zero frequency modulation, or this complex signal is through zero frequency modulating the nyoni. But again, because this is more complex audio, it's not a fixed, consistent waveform. So this adds a bit more complexity to the sound. And this is actually brought back into the lowest input here of the Leon, and I'm using a half attenuation blue pin to patch that. So let's go fully dry on the arbor. I'll pull these pins so we're no longer hearing the CSL sources direct. What we're hearing now is all via the nyoni. Just get a different control combination. So you can hear when it settles on some sort of pattern, this has got quite a wide range of frequencies. So it will jump down to really low frequency content up to really high, chirpy bird sound territory. And when that's controlling this in a through zero context, we end up hearing additional movement and pitches through that. So I found this a really interesting way to get rhythmic low-end material. So when this gets close to stalling, where you'll see it settle on either white or yellow, that means that the output of this has settled to close to 0 hertz. And then as soon as the pitch ramps up due to a vector direction of the source audio going into the FM input, that will cause the pitch to swing quite dramatically. So in addition to the more raw signal from the CSL, if I do that, remove the nyoni version, we're just hearing the higher frequency content. We're not hearing any lower rhythmic percussive stuff until I add this in. So I end up with a much richer range of timbres. So that's an interesting use case for the nyoni, or for through zero FM in general, for creating lower frequency or lower range audible frequency content for a complex signal. And you can hear, you can get radically different rhythmic ostinatos from the Tetragrid depending on where you place the pins. So it sounds repeating because I'm using a primary input or a primary output to control the C switch, is then cascading and changing the switching of different things. So there is a ratio between the pitch controls going to the volt per octave and the clock frequency that's toggling on and off the two audio sources. But overall, I found it would land in quite an interesting repeating pattern quite frequently. Cool. Okay, let's talk about the arbor now. Because we basically got this complex source coming in, and I would let it sit onto a repeating pattern. I'm using this 1F fader as a means to add in reverb throws, or to create more of a stereo spread. Because as you can see, there's when it's dual mono, we've got a direct diagonal where it's equal amplitude of left and right. It spreads out across the XY plane when there's content that's different between the two channels. So as the reverb algorithm is a stereo reverb, we get it opens up space. So the 1F is actually acting as an attenuator over a modulation signal, and that's coming from this lower output from one of the octs. So that's a bipolar modulator. It's going via the 1F. Output of that is going to the mod input on the arbor, and this is set to the reverb mode, which is done with the little slide switches on the back inside of the module. So anything that's positive CV, I'll take out the oct signal, so I'm just using this as a manual fader. Anything that's positive CV, I'm just bringing up the wet level of the reverb up to full saturated. I believe 5 volts is the range, so obviously as this fader gets to the mid position, that's it, fully saturating with the maximum reverb. If I invert this, so I'm using negative CV, the negative range increases the reverb amount up to 5 volts, but you can hear it actually fades out the dry signal, so you end up with just the space, the reverberance. So it's really nice for mixing in throws that have a bit more space to them, but without the presence of the dry signal. So when it's coming from the output of an oct or any bipolar modulator, I can control when there's a reverb throw, but it's going to be random whether or not it's positive or negative reverb. So this oct actually the main modulator for many parameters on the arbor. Also add a note just now that the top output is self-modulating the oct, so we're getting less consistent triangle wave LFOs. It's stepping in a more sporadic shape. So one of them is going to the 1F, which is controlling the reverb, but we also have modulation over. We've got grain length, we have modulation of the scan, as well as we've got spray layer, which I mentioned earlier. That's actually coming from this tie. So with the level all the way down, we're keeping to just the alpha layer, the blue layer, but as soon as I bring up any depth of this, then every clock of the cease, every attack phase, that's clocking the sample and hold, and we'll be throwing into a different layer or buffer. I'll keep it blue just now. Layer, and we have random CV, bipolar CV over the grain direction, as well as the grain windowing. And that might actually be it. Yeah, so I've got most of these controlled somewhat centered, and there's just movement of automation via their modulation. And I think as I was patching originally, I did addition a few different rates of modulation for different ones, and just found something that I felt had a particularly natural range of movement. So anytime I can turn over to the wet, and it's going to be playing back granular content. So intensity I have non-modulated, so that's a manual control, and I'm able to manually ride that to essentially control the intensity of the granular playback. Another method that I didn't use in the performance video, I've got the rightmost output of the Tetragrid here. There we are, which is it's the faster clock, because I had this pot at the 12 o'clock position. And at times I was playing with this patched to the strike input. So the grains were being triggered at the rate of that particular Tetragrid output. I found this gave me a bit more of degree of control over being able to throw in silence. So that became my performance control aspect for the textural non-harmonic part of the patch. I'd ride this to being completely dry and then manually add reverb throws. And it's very much a feedback performance where I'm hearing what the what the algorithm's doing, and can add space by increasing reverb, which spreads it to being stereo, as well as being able to throw over to granular playback, which will be scattered grains, hard left and hard right by nature, in combination with reverb that's creating a lot of stereo spread. So there's a nice range of depth between mono and stereo throughout the patch. So for actually triggering the capturing into the arbhar, I've got dub all the way down, so anytime it's refilling the buffer, it's new content, it's not layering up previous parts of the patch. I've just got the audio going straight into the sense input, which then normals, or the onset input, which normals to the input, senses up a bit, and it means that the holds all the way up. So that's going to record for the maximum amount of time before rearming it and looking for an onset detection to trigger it. This might be slightly confusing. The LED buttons on this particular arbhar is inverted, which is why it's in my case, because to correct that I'll need to disassemble the whole thing and remove the button and put around the right way. So this will, in correct context, should actually be yellow most of the time with little white blips whenever it starts capturing. Yeah, so that's unique to this system and this particular arbhar. So that's why it was on the B stockpile. But yeah, just imagine those colors are inverted. Yeah, so it's basically just constantly recording. As soon as the buffer's filled, it will inevitably start recording anyway, because there's always some sort of motion in the source audio. If it froze for whatever reason, I just need to change the ratio and get to a different sonic realm, or I could just manually hit the capture button. So this is a technique I've used quite a lot in my own patching. This one being particularly more chaotic because I'm using complex atonal audio. But as I bring up the tie and it's selecting through the different buffers, I have the record and play control tied together, which is the default setting. So on the arbhar, you could actually hold shift, turn the pot, and then you could lock a record destination. So anytime it's capturing, it's always going to be recording to the beta buffer there. If I hold it again, turn it all the way around, then they're both tied together. There's an offset because there's CV going in. There, so that's more direct. So anytime a new buffer's selected and capturing is restarted, it will capture to that buffer. Even if the playback buffer changes, it's still capturing to that buffer area. So there's a randomization of 6 buffers or layers that can be recorded to on the fly. And playback is going to be jumping around based on the CV here. So it's a way of adding kind of a lag to the granular playback of the content. Normally when I'm doing this patch, I'll use tonal material. So I might have a sequence or something quantized through the harmony. So it might be a pentatonic scale or something like that. And then I'll be playing in static notes into buffers at random. And then the granular playback, I'll either use CV over the scan when it's set to omega, or I'll have CV over buffer randomization, and then it'll be pulling content from somewhat recent capturing, but it means it's not always immediate. So it means it's a nice way for tonal stuff to layer up tones and create harmonies spread across buffers, because if a grain fires and the layer changes, that grain's still going to complete. So if it's a longer grain length, then you can have multiple 3-second grains overlapping and playing together. I'll bring it back to just blue so we keep things a bit more consistent. Okay, I think that's covering a lot of bases. Now we're on to the harmonic voice, I guess. I'll maybe cover this first. So the output of the arbhar is going into these two input channels on the Leon, and then I'm mixing to my main output left and right at unity level with these two pins, and they're going to these outputs, which are my main output to 1 and 2 on the scope for XY, and that's patched round going to the output. I'm using this configuration also so that I have an extra purple pin on hand that I can patch in to either one of these inputs. So this is the output of the arbhar, which is going direct to my output. But if I patch a node here, for example, then that's going to take a level of this lower output of the arbhar, or the upper one, depending on what node I patch to. It's going to then mix it to this output, which cascades here, and mixes into my signal going to the arbhar via this tan H. So it's actually patching an additional feedback loop level at a quarter amplitude, because it's a purple pin. And if I do this, take the reverb off. There we go. You can hear that almost resonator type sound. Let's try. There's a very distinctive resonant tone coming in. It's quite metallic. Try the lower node. There we go, that's more prominent. So what's happening there, that's a mix of the output of the arbhar going back in to the input. And it being a digital module, there's a core level of latency by nature. So that latency is cascading, and you're getting this almost Karplus-like resonance to it, which is just quite fun to add in. I did play about with using the white pins, which are half-wave rectifying. They get quite bright, I find. Let's try the lower one. There we are, getting more distorted reverbs. And of course, if I do granular playback, that's playing that signal back in, which is then capturing in. So we're kind of getting a longer feedback loop depending on what the granular playback content is versus what's being recaptured into the buffer. So a bizarre granular feedback loop. Can get pretty intense. Cool, so that's the chaotic sound elements covered, I think. I'll pull these pins and reduce this down so that we're getting a lower level of the CSL voice, just barely coming through the Gnoni, so it's not gone completely. Let's look at the harmonic voice. So this is my go-to classic harmony into Saïch subtractive synthesis patch. I'm actually omitting the third. I've got this set to Lydian, I believe. Yeah, that sounds right. So, root, 5th and 7th. And there might be, yeah. So there is some interval offset play in effect on the Saïch, and that's adding additional harmonization tones, tension tones. So this is tuned to wherever it is. I'm using the root going into the primary input, so the first oscillator and second oscillator are doubling the root, and then I've got third and seventh. Yep. Harmony control, open voicing, although I can also change that on the fly. Gate output of the harmony is controlling the second cease up here as an ADSR. Output of that is opening the 1047 filter. So cutoff's down low and it's just softly opening it. There's a little bit of resonance, and I'm coming from the notch output, and the notch offset is set hard left. So when it's hard left, it's doubling the low pass output. So I think on the final chord in the performance video, settle there, and I can then bring it over to being high pass, and it adds a bit more fizziness to the sound. So playing with that going into the arbhar. To capture. There we go. Again, granular playback of that as well. Has a bit of a higher end bright control. And last detail, there is a little bit of gentle FM, so just vibrato coming from the top channel of this second oct here. That guy there. Just a small amount, just to add a bit of wobble. I think originally it was static in my first patching, but it just softens things a little bit when there's a bit of vibrato on that. I've actually got a loose cable here. What I had happening before, but ultimately I felt was a bit too much for controlling. I have CV input of the Saïch set to the global detune. So with an interval offset, I can choose whether that's fully, the offset's reduced down and removed. So depending on which interval offset's chosen, I can choose the glissando over that voicing spread. And I was using a triangle LFO from the oct, which is full 10 volts peak to peak, -5 to +5. That CV's going in, and if I bring the attenuverter all the way up and center the fader over that parameter, then I get movement while the triangle's in motion through the zero portion. But as I've got this all the way up, I'm essentially hard clipping the triangle to a flat point, so it's settling on the outer reaches of the interval offset spread. It's a nice detail, but I think it was ultimately a bit much for back to normal. You might also hear that when the harmony's playing, or when this harmony voice is playing, there's vibrato over the pitch of the chord, but it's also the amplitude's not stable. So that is basically a byproduct of using the gnoni in this configuration, where when it gets towards stalling, there will be a DC offset produce the output, and that signal, if I trace this through, here we go, that pin there, so that's the blue pin. So I've got half attenuation of that mixed in with this node here, which is the source from the 1047. So that's my subtractive voice, which is at unity gain, mixing to the patch cable going to the arbhar. And that's summing in with this Gnoni, which is heavily DC offset depending on where it lands. So if I remove this pin, we have a lot more stability to the chord. But I actually liked it as a touch, where we're getting interaction of the... It's almost like automatic sidechaining. As there's motion in the audio content from the CSL via the through zero frequency modulation, that's kind of automatically ducking the chord. So I'll add my direct source from the CSL back in. There we go. Cool. I think that covers the majority of things, at least. There might be something I've missed here and there. But yeah, I'm going to transcribe this in detail and then come back and start from an initialized system, and we'll try and get back to this general sonic area. See you in a bit. Here we go. Hopefully I've taken detailed enough notes to recreate this patch. I'm going to start with the harmony voice, just because once the rest of the patch starts to happen, this section got very buried very quickly under patch cables. It also means that once I've got it all dialed in and tuned, it's somewhat set and forget. So that's root 5 and 7 going into the Saïch. So we'll run this through the 1047 now, and I'll monitor that directly. My main outs. I'll just patch this direct to start. A reference here. Sounds about right. Sounds pretty close. Okay, let's use the gate out from the harmony, trigger this ADSR, and that will be high attack, not quite as high decay, full sustain, and a slow release. Longer patch cable. And that's going to the FM input and the attenuator horizontal. That's in a good spot. Okay, in my notes I've got the output going to input 5 of the Leon, and oh, we're missing an oct. We're missing modulation over the pitch to add vibrato. Okay, harmonic voice done. Let's dive into the real nuts and bolts of this patch. I think I'll start with the Tetragrid here next and build up the control scheme that's going into the CSL and arbhar, because once that's set up, it's literally just the two outs from the CSL that we need to follow through with. Okay, so it's these two outputs here. We need longer patch cables. There we go. Okay, so these two outputs, I'll put them on the scope just now, just so we can see what's going on. I think I described it earlier on in this video, but there's quite a lot going on with the Tetragrid alone. So I'll set this to roughly where I had it, these two pots. So this was all the way down, and this was at about 12 o'clock, and that was giving me my foundation level of pitches for the oscillator, or frequencies for the oscillators. I'll change this to voltage monitor mode. Okay, so we can see on channels 1 and 4, these are the two outputs. And I'll start just adding a few magnets on. There, so already there's more activity happening. So they seem to be mirroring each other to an extent. I think that's just by sheer chance, because they can be completely independent if there's no magnetic patch points placed. Cool. What I'll do, I'll actually run these through these two channels, because that way I can flick back and forth to them, as we only need the Mordax for visualizations. Anyway, so let's follow through this patch. We had one going to that TANH, And so I'm going to that tangent. Volt per octave and volt per octave. So I'll keep these disconnected first, and let's just monitor the CSL on its own to get a sense of what we're dealing with. So index routing is unchanged, so I didn't initialize that. So this is, these 4 LEDs are currently on. So it's giving me these two, which indicate that the FM bus is controlled from the index, and the other two are coming from the symmetry inputs. I think they were set like that. So this is my fundamental pitch. Wavefolder is just before it starts to fold. Now if I bring up the FM levels, as I bring up the index control, I'm starting to introduce the cross modulation between the two voices. So it's very much a static, churning voice on its own. The other final output will be much the same. Let's introduce these volt per octave signals. So already we're getting something very rhythmic coming from the Tetragrid control over these volt per octave signals. Cool. Okay, let's take the outputs now and run them through the tine. So I'm going to send these to each of the lower inputs if we're going in a 2-to-1 configuration. And then the output of those goes to 1 and 2 on the Leon. There we go. And let's just monitor from that end output for reference. So this is an equal sum of the two wavefolder signals, and I can turn them on or off via the latching switches of the tine. So let's add CV control over these switches. So that comes from, where are we? That's from the first output of the Tetragrid. And I was using the cease for this. So initially I think I was using one of these outputs in a previous patch for clocking the sample and hold. But I'll patch this in here. We'll see the rising edge is not perfectly straight, so it's not a sharp rising edge on this, due to the fact that the cores of these are ramp waveforms. So the frequency is possibly at a point where it's angling up and then saturating at the top. So it's not the same as having a true square wave. It's a saturated ramp waveform, essentially. So if that's, but it being a gate signal still, even if it is a softer edged gate, it's still plenty to trigger the cease. Let me find the values for this. Quite low attack. Right about there. Now, can come out of the decay and release, and they're going to control the latching state of the two switches. And this is producing the gating of the two audio sources. Cool. And I'll add one patch cable in here. This is now the attack stage gate clocking the tie. Okay, so these two outputs are going to be controlling the wavefold depth CV inputs of the CSL. Cool. Okay, let's introduce the arbhar into this. I'm just going to patch it direct to start with, and then we'll eventually mix it correctly via the Leon. I want to get the dry throughput signal as I want it. Microphone's working, even though we're not using that. So onset detection, and that's going to be coming from gamma, third output. And I'm going to create a mix of these two signals. Cool. And this is actually going via a tan H. At this point I can bring up the sense input. Oh, that should go into onset input. And I'll set the hold, full and dub at minimum. So this way, with the dub all the way down, it's never going to retain previous content in the buffer. It'll always refill the entire buffer with the hold all the way up with new content. Okay, let's add our through 0FM branch into the mix. So the output of that is going to input 6. And we'll add that in here with a blue pin. And then we're going to be taking a parallel branch of the CSL voice. So that's these two here. And if I use the last column, I've still got these two pins in, so that's going to be giving an equal send of this to the first column as well as the last column. There we go, that's added some low frequency content to the audio mix. I'll mute this so we're only hearing the Gnoni version. So you can hear any points that there's low frequency activity from the CSL voice at any point, which we might not necessarily hear beyond just clicks and pops. So we can hear the higher frequency stuff. So rumbles and kicks and wobbles, that sort of sound, like they're all coming from the through 0 FM. Cool. Okay, we've got this going into the arbor. We can have granular playback, but this is all still just static. Let's add some modulation to the various parameters. So I'm going to use this oct here. I'm going to self-patch it so that we have, instead of it being clean triangle LFOs, we now have more disjointed, almost stepping shapes that are still bipolar, plus or minus 5 volts. Okay, I'm going to follow my notes and try and keep the same output pattern going to the same parameter as I had before, just for consistency. So output 2 is going to our grain direction parameter. Now you can see there's more of a pattern between the oscillations, but it being a higher frequency modulator, it's still going to be fluctuating quite rapidly. Output 3 is going to scan. So this is now modulating the scan position. I'll keep this knob in the middle so that way it's bipolar movement around that center point. 4 is going to spray. So this is controlling how much it's spreading out the playhead points for the grains from the main playback position. Okay, 5 is going to mod for the CV, but it's actually going via this 1F. Then we have 2 more. We have 6, and that's going to go to grain windowing. So I'll center the actual knob, so now we're getting modulation through the various grain shapes. So we can go to more percussive on the square end, or to the ramp, although that will be a combination of ramps and swells depending on the direction. And our last LFO is going to go to length, I think. Yep. So now, if I go over to wet, we should be getting a nice range of textures. I think for the most part I kept the pitch deviation knob centered and pitch at the center, so it's at the original pitch. But throwing it up to full clockwise, that will give octave deviations between the grains. That's sounding pretty cool. It's keeping quite a nice rhythmic ostinato over the whole thing. add in a pin there, which will let me bring in some harmonic patching. Cool. Okay, so this is currently coming straight from the arbhar. I'm going to patch this via the Leon now, and this will give the ability to directly patch feedback. There we go, and our main left and right out. Completely misjudged the cable size. There we go, and unity gain pins for left and right. And now I've got the option of patching a pin to create a feedback loop. Got that sort of tinny resonance sound to it. Here, as I'm bridging certain contact points on the Tetragrid, it's changing the rate of modulation between the cores. So I'm essentially mixing up my ostinato, mixing up the pattern it's producing. Okay, we've only got a few cables to go, I think. I'll take the output of this tie and I'm going to patch that to the layer CV of the arbhar. Bring the harmony voice down a bit more. And now, as it's capturing continually, it's starting to fill up different buffers. So if I now if I play with the CSL voice, creating different timbral content, if I go to Granular, I should now be getting little throwbacks of previously captured content. So it's almost like a bigger performative delay over the content that's being produced, and there is a degree of randomization where the high sample and hold is randomly picking a buffer to capture into, as well as randomly playing from different buffers. Let's see what other chaos we can create. I'll add a few more magnets. If at any point I want more immediacy to the granularization of a signal, I just reduce the depth or the level from the tie, and that will bring it back to the alpha buffer. I could then reset the capturing, and immediately I'm starting to capture that current voice. That take, as I've held down the harmony note, that's now captured to the buffer, so the granular playback is now introducing elements of that chord. There are a lot of factors to the Tetragrid for defining the tempo of the pattern that it might settle on. In this case, it depends on what rate the cease is being clocked at, which will change the timing between decay and release for controlling the latching switches. So it does take a lot of experimentation to find a position where it's settled and repeats stably. That's a settled into something more rhythmic. And at that point, it doesn't matter if I change the interaction between the CSL voices. The rhythmic aspect is somewhat fixed due to the Tetragrid. I find a lot of the times with this range of frequency content from the CSL, you can get things that sound almost electromechanical, like mechanical switching or clockwork devices. Quite nice when it settles on something that feels like a natural groove, because you're very much then improvising with the device. I'd highly recommend keeping a recorder on for as long as possible, because you don't know when it's going to land on something musically useful. smallest touch on the Tetragrid surface can completely change the pattern. So let's see what happens if I just bridge two of the pieces. That one almost flipped the rhythm. You can think of it as a hard sync, essentially. If I'm bridging it, I'm causing the cross modulation to occur at a different time than it would have naturally. With a bigger system, if I had another tine, maybe another cease, what I might try and do is automate the jump between wet and dry on the arbhar. In the performance, I was very much just manually riding the control. And as the aux, the source that's modulating the parameters of the arbhar, you never really know where it's going to land in terms of grain density, size, whether it'll be textural or more of a layered up, sample segment, which is part of the fun of it, of course. I've managed to recreate that quite close to what I had before. I'm playing it less aggressively than in the performance video, I think. So to end, let's throw in a few more magnets. Let the chaos take over a bit. What I did to end the patch last time, I unpatched my LFO to the 1F, so it's now just a manual control over reverb mount. Set it fully wet, so it's heavy layers of granular, and then manually do a reverb throw. Where I'm muting the dry audio, I've brought the reverb all the way up and just let the tail decay naturally. Yeah, a pretty fun patch. There's probably more efficient ways to do certain aspects, but especially with the Tetragrid and the Leon, different ways of quickly changing routing configurations and rhythmic bases for the clocking. It's a very hands-on performance patch. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.